Have you ever wondered how a single mistake, one that changes every aspect of life, can tie itself to an old, painful story? Greystone Hall, once radiant in its glory, had now become a prison of shadows and forgotten memories. Then, a letter arrived, revealing a truth that had never seen the light of day. This wasn't just a tale of a horrifying murder. This was the story of a long-buried truth, one that forces you to confront pain, fear, and the true nature of humanity. And just when you think it's all over, think again. The hardest and darkest truth is about to come to light. The 1st of October, as twilight sank its teeth into the Kent countryside, a ghostly stillness blanketed the winding country lane that led to Greystone Manor. The wheels of a dark motorcar whispered against the gravel, its headlights slicing through the thick, silvery mist that clung like cobwebs to the gnarled trees and hedgerows. The air was damp, reluctant, as if nature itself hesitated to allow the past to awaken. Greystone emerged slowly from the shroud of fog, an imposing ivy-strangled mansion crouched between ancient oaks, its high stone gables brooding beneath a dull leaden sky. The scent of rain still lingered in the wind, and the heavy iron gates groaned open as though disturbed from slumber. Inside the motorcar, Captain James Harrow sat stiffly beside the legendary detective Monsieur Alaric Duval, whose sharp eyes remained fixed ahead with the cool detachment of a man who had seen too much, yet trusted nothing. Harrow cleared his throat, his voice low but uncertain. Quite the place, picturesque, yet somehow unsettling. Duval adjusted the crease of his dove-grey trousers with precise care, replying in a voice as smooth as smoke, "Yes, mon ami. Beauty often guards the gates of horror, especially when one is invited by a corpse." Harrow turned sharply. "You suspect foul play already?" Duval didn't answer. Instead, he offered a single, unreadable glance that silenced further questions. The car slowed and came to a halt at the foot of the manor's wide stone steps. An elderly butler awaited them, spine rigid, face carved from discipline, and eyes that revealed nothing. "Monsieur Duval, Captain Harrow, welcome to Greystone." He bowed stiffly, stepping aside. As the great door creaked open, they were met by Lady Isadora Greystone, tall, statuesque, and wrapped in grief as one might wear a ceremonial cloak. Her silver hair was pulled tightly back, every inch of her posture commanding and cold. "Thank you for answering my summons," she said, her voice clipped and dry, devoid of warmth. Duval bowed politely. "It is I who am honored, madame." The entry hall beyond breathed with quiet grandeur, polished floors, towering oil portraits of glowering ancestors, and the faint scent of rosewood polish mixing with the decay of time. The guests were ushered into the drawing room, where the rest of the family waited like figures in a living painting, each one framed by suspicion and silence. There was Frederick Greystone, the heir, a tall man with a permanent furrow in his brow, swirling brandy in a glass he never drank. Beside him stood his sister Eleanor, her pallor matched only by the black lace gloves that trembled at her sides. Colonel Arthur Mallory, their cousin by marriage, leaned against the fireplace, all military precision and silent judgment. And seated alone by the far window where the last light of day barely reached, was Juliet Vimy, the orphaned ward of the late Lord Greystone, serene, observant, and unsettlingly calm. After brief, strained introductions, Lady Isadora wasted no time. "You may wonder why I've called you here, Monsieur Duval. I will be blunt. 3 nights ago, my niece Vivienne was found dead in the lake behind this estate. The coroner ruled it an accident." Her jaw tightened. "I do not agree." The room tensed, the air turning heavier, colder. Duval's eyes sharpened. "On what grounds, madame?" Isadora's voice thinned like ice cracking. "Vivienne feared water, always had. Even as a child, she couldn't bear to go near the lake. She would flinch if the surface so much as rippled. And yet, she was found drowned, dressed in the very same mourning gown she wore to her mother's funeral." Eleanor gave a soft gasp, as though struck. "Aunt, please." She was distressed, Frederick said, cutting in, his voice brittle. There had been disagreements, tensions in the family. Duval arched a brow. Tensions, the most fertile ground for darkness to bloom. Colonel Mallory stepped forward, his tone curt. If this is going to become a spectacle, it is only conversation, monsieur, Duval said coolly, raising a hand. The truth rarely announces itself politely. He turned to the veiled figure by the window. And you, mademoiselle, did Vivienne seem herself? Juliet looked up slowly. No, she said, softly. She was frightened. She told me someone was watching her. She said the house listened at night. A silence followed, chilling and absolute. Harrow shifted uncomfortably. Duval's gaze drifted to the tall curtains, beyond which the lake shimmered faintly in the mist, a dark mirror that had swallowed one of their own. Then perhaps, he said at last, we should begin where the water hides its secrets. Lady Isadora nodded. You may see the lake, and her room, though I warn you neither offer comfort. Duval turned to Harrow with a faint smile. Come, mon ami. This house wears its sorrow like a mask. But behind every mask is a face, and behind every face, a story that waits to be uncovered. And with that they stepped deeper into Greystone Manor, unaware that the house itself had already begun watching them. The soft hush of morning gave way to an uneasy stillness, as famed Belgian detective Lucien Moreau stepped into the tangled shadows of Halewood Estate, where tragedy hung thick in the mist like an unfinished sentence. The sky, painted in hesitant grays, barely allowed the sun to breathe as Moreau and his companion, Inspector Graham Thorne, followed a narrow, dew-slick path curling behind the manor toward the lake where the body of Evelyn Harrow had been discovered just 2 days prior. The air held that damp, breathless quality of something unsaid, and even the birds seemed to avoid the trees that bowed mournfully toward the glass-like water. At the far bank, beneath the gnarled limbs of a willow stooped like a grieving mother, Evelyn had been found, face down, her raven hair fanned in the water like dark silk, her body clad in a black mourning gown that clung to her frame like a second skin. It was Mrs. Adelaide Northcott, the family's long-serving housekeeper, who led them there now, her steps steady but voice low with restraint. She was discovered here, just after dawn by young Michael, the stable boy. Said he thought it was a ghost at first, she whispered, eyes not meeting theirs. Moreau, crouching low by the bank, studied the scene with clinical calm, his fingertips grazing the earth. And her shoes, he asked without looking up. Were they found? Adelaide hesitated. No, not here. They were by the back veranda. Thorne frowned, glancing at the weeping willow. Odd, why would she walk barefoot all this way? And in mourning attire, no less. Moreau straightened slowly. Because she didn't walk, he said softly. She was brought. His hand pointed to a barely visible drag in the mud, too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be overlooked. And yet, he continued, eyes narrowing, no signs of a struggle, no broken branches. Whoever moved her did so carefully, intimately. As they turned back, Adelaide's voice cracked faintly. She wasn't weak, sir. Everyone said she was fragile. But Evelyn had fire. The family couldn't tame her spirit, only feared what she knew. And what did she know? Moreau asked. Adelaide hesitated, then lowered her eyes. Secrets, monsieur. Old ones. Ones we don't dare repeat in daylight. Back inside, the mood darkened further as they were led up to Evelyn's bedroom by her cousin, Beatrice Vale, a woman whose quiet elegance masked a tremor in her hands. The room, still untouched since her death, was immaculate, painfully so. A writing desk sat in one corner, organized to the inch, and atop it lay a sealed letter, unaddressed, unlabeled, almost daring to be read. I found it there, Beatrice whispered. But I didn't open it. I couldn't. Moreau turned it over in his hand, feeling the weight of words unsaid, then placed it gently down. The wardrobe stood ajar, revealing modest garments in grey and navy, except for one, a crimson gown that blazed like a wound amid the ashes. Beatrice's voice dropped. She was going to wear it to the autumn gala next week. Said she was done mourning for a life she never got to live. Moreau studied the gown, then moved to the vanity, noting a perfume bottle slightly tilted, a smudge on the mirror. See here, he murmured to Thorne. This room is not untouched. It's been made to appear untouched. There's intent in that. Thorne's brow creased. You think someone entered after the death? Or before? Moreau replied coldly. To search, to remove, or perhaps, to say goodbye. He turned toward the door and added quietly. Was it custom for the family to lock their rooms at night? Beatrice shook her head. Only Evelyn did. She said she heard whispers in the corridor, long after midnight. Said the house remembered things others wanted to forget. Moreau's eyes lingered on the mirror, one last time. Then perhaps, he said, his voice a thread of steel. This house is not finished speaking. Under a velvet dusk that hung heavy over the cold sprawl of Blackwater Grange, the once celebrated Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, stepped lightly through the aging corridors, as if even the floorboards whispered secrets beneath his shoes. The air was thick with the hush of morning, yet something far more sinister lurked behind the silence, a weight not born from grief, but from fear. Lady Evelyn Ravenscroft's estate, draped in layers of shadow and secrets, had become the reluctant stage for a death wrapped in contradiction. At the center of it all lay Cassandra Vale, discovered lifeless beneath the ancient elm near the greenhouse, her body dressed in a sapphire silk gown that shimmered unnaturally under moonlight. A gown meant for celebration, not sorrow. She was supposed to wear it next week at the charity ball, murmured Amelia Vale, Cassandra's estranged sister, her voice cracking like the frost-rimed windows of the drawing room. Poirot, ever still yet perpetually in motion within his mind, stood beside the tall window overlooking the very spot Cassandra had been found, his eyes narrowing at the faint outline of footprints leading away from the elm. One trail light, the other deliberate. A gown such as this, he said, more to himself than to Hastings, is not chosen in grief. It is defiance, or perhaps, a declaration. The family had dismissed it as a tragic accident, sleepwalking they said, or perhaps a fainting spell. But Poirot had already noted the inconsistencies. The gown's hem bore no trace of mud, her feet were clean, and yet the path from the conservatory to the elm was thick with wet earth. Cassandra had not walked there. She had been carried. Upstairs in her private chambers, Poirot's attention was drawn to the wardrobe. Locked, yet with no key in sight. Amelia claimed no knowledge of the lock. It had never been used. With a slender hairpin and a precise hand, Poirot opened it gently. Inside a single space hung bare, save for a lone velvet hanger, still holding a stray thread of blue silk. But beside it, taped to the wood, was a folded note, torn at the corner and unaddressed. She should have burned it like she promised. Poirot exchanged a look with Hastings, who now stood stiff with unease. This, Poirot murmured, is not the language of grief, Hastings. It is the language of betrayal. In the adjoining drawer, under carefully folded scarves, lay a brooch, a twisted arrangement of pearls and garnets, the clasp broken as though torn from fabric. Amelia gasped softly behind them. That was hers. Mother's. Cassandra only wore it with that dress. But it vanished days ago. Poirot nodded, eyes glittering. And now it returns. But not with her. Without her. Downstairs. Lady Evelyn grew pale when Poirot requested Cassandra's journal. She wrote little, she said. But Amelia interrupted. That's not true. She wrote constantly. Pages and pages every night. Poirot's silence was answer enough. When the journal was produced at last, it was incomplete, pages ripped, dates missing. But one remained, a solitary confession penned days before her death. They told me silence is safety, but I feel it tighten like a rope around my throat. The dress will speak for me. They cannot ignore what they see. That night, as shadows swallowed the hallways whole, Poirot stood once more by the wardrobe. It had been relocked, yet the faint scent of Cassandra's perfume lingered, bitter almond and despair. Someone is trying to erase her, he whispered. But ghosts, Hastings. Ghosts leave fingerprints, where the living do not. And somewhere, in the silence of Blackwater Grange, something watched, something waited. Poirot stood before the wardrobe, his gaze intense as he surveyed the empty space, where the dress had once hung like a bold proclamation. It's gone, he muttered, almost to himself. Gone because someone feared what it represented. Or perhaps what it concealed. Hastings, always eager to grasp the weight of every word, leaned in. "You think the dress was a clue?" he asked. Poirot nodded slowly, a thoughtful glimmer in his eyes. "Possibly. But more than that. It was a symbol. Clothing has a way of speaking louder than words, especially when it's chosen with such purpose." Clara, standing beside them, suddenly gripped the wardrobe door, her fingers trembling. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot turned to her, every muscle in his body now alert. "The night before Lillian died, I overheard her in the library, arguing with someone. I didn't want to get involved, but I heard her say, 'You won't shame me. I'll wear what I please.' And then a door slammed." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. "Who was she speaking to?" he asked. Clara hesitated, as if the answer weighed heavily on her. "I don't know. But it wasn't Ivy. It was a man's voice. I think it might have been Edwin." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. The next morning, Poirot found himself in Edwin Arlingham's study, the room cloaked in an oppressive silence. Books lined the shelves, their leather spines a testament to time's unyielding passage. Edwin sat behind his desk, his face pale but composed. "Mr. Arlingham," Poirot began, his voice measured, "you were close to Lillian, correct?" Edwin's hesitation spoke volumes. "As close as family can be," he replied, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. "You saw her the night before her death?" Poirot pressed. Edwin stiffened. "We spoke," he answered, his voice clipped. "Spoke or argued?" Poirot's question cut through the air. Edwin's eyes flickered, betraying the tension beneath his calm exterior. "We disagreed. She was threatening to disgrace the family. She wanted to announce something at the harvest ball. A personal matter." Poirot's interest peaked. "What was it?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. Edwin hesitated, the weight of the secret pressing on him. Finally, he spoke. "She was going to announce her engagement to someone outside the family, a man none of us approved of. She knew it would humiliate my mother, which is why she insisted on wearing that red dress." Poirot nodded slowly, processing the revelation. "And then what happened?" he asked. "She left the room. I thought she'd cooled off, but I didn't see her again until the next morning by the lake." Poirot studied Edwin, his sharp mind connecting the dots. "This man, her supposed fiancé, did you ever learn his name?" Edwin's silence spoke volumes. "No," he murmured. "She kept it from us." As Poirot left the study, his mind churned with the implications of what he had learned. A mystery man, a scandal hidden in the folds of family loyalty, a missing dress, and a threat delivered in silence. It all pointed to something far darker. Later that evening, Poirot returned to the house, his thoughts still tangled in the web of deceit that surrounded Lillian's death. He stood before the wardrobe once more, the door creaking open under his touch. The red dress, the symbol of defiance, was gone. "Gone!" Hastings exclaimed. "But it was here this morning." Poirot's gaze hardened as he examined the brass keyhole, noting the faint scratch that marred its surface. "It was forced," he murmured, his gloved finger tracing the marks. "Crude work, but hurried." He turned to Clara, his expression grave. "Who else had access to this room besides you?" he asked. Clara's gaze flickered. "Well, the maid, of course. And Ivy, Edwin sometimes. Geoffrey." Her voice trailed off as the truth began to unfold in her mind. A missing brooch, a mysterious fiancé, and now the disappearance of the dress. Every piece of the puzzle seemed to be slipping just out of reach. But Poirot knew the answer lay somewhere in the shadows, buried beneath layers of lies and secrets, waiting to be uncovered. Hercule Poirot stood before the fire, the soft crackle of the flames casting a dim glow on his face, his expression deep in thought. Across from him, Captain Hastings shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed. "You're certain about this?" Hastings whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet of the room. Poirot, his steely gaze fixed on the shadows flickering across the walls, nodded slowly. "I am certain, mon ami," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable tension. There is more to this than anyone is willing to admit. Lillian's death, her sudden and mysterious demise, is merely the beginning. There are secrets buried deep within these walls. Secrets that no one dares speak aloud, yet they whisper between the cracks. Poirot's fingers lightly tapped the armrest of his chair, his mind racing through the maze of contradictions and lies he had encountered since his arrival at Greystone Hall. "It is clear now," he continued, his eyes narrowing with sharp precision. "Someone is desperate to keep the truth hidden. Someone, perhaps, with a far more significant stake in this than anyone suspects. And this Martin Ellison, this poor man who dared to love outside the circle of the rich and powerful, he is at the heart of it all. But why does the mere mention of his name fill this household with such fear?" Hastings shifted his weight, his face clouded with confusion. "You think Lillian's family was behind it?" Poirot turned to him, his gaze hardening. "Not necessarily, Hastings. But I believe someone from within these walls knew of Lillian's secret, knew of her forbidden love for Martin, and feared what would happen if that secret came to light. She had made her intentions clear. She would wear that red dress to the ball. She would announce her engagement to him, and nothing could stop her. But someone did not want that. Someone wanted to silence her, and they did so with methodical precision." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before continuing. "And now this dress, the one that Martin altered, is gone. Why? What did it conceal? Was it merely a symbol of rebellion? Or something more?" Hastings frowned, trying to piece together the puzzle. "But why the note, Poirot? The one you received? The warning?" Poirot's lips curled into a small grim smile. "The note is the final piece, my friend. It is a message from someone desperate, someone who has been watching us closely, monitoring every step we take. They fear what we might uncover, what truths we might expose. They know the moment we speak of Martin Ellison, we are closer to unraveling everything." Poirot rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, as he straightened his coat. "I must speak to Lady Eugenia," he said, his voice low but certain. "She holds the key to this mystery. She knows who Martin Ellison is, and she knows why his name is so dangerous. She is the one who stands to lose the most, if his identity is ever revealed. It is time for her to face the truth, and the truth, mon ami, always has a way of coming to light." As Poirot and Hastings made their way through the darkened halls of Greystone, the silence was oppressive, the house holding its breath, as if waiting for the inevitable. The clock struck midnight, its toll echoing through the corridors, the sound reverberating like a warning. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open. Poirot's gaze flicked to the shadowy hallway beyond, and he stopped in his tracks. "Someone is here," he murmured, his sharp eyes scanning the dark. "We are not alone." Hastings stiffened, his hand instinctively moving towards his sidearm. "What now?" he whispered. Poirot smiled slightly, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Now, Hastings, we wait. The truth will come to us, whether they like it or not." The clock in the manor struck midnight, its deep toll reverberating through the still dark halls of Greystone Hall. A chill had settled in, the house now silent, save for the soft tap of rain against the windows, and the occasional creak of ancient floorboards. Yet, in the stillness, Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings moved with the precision of shadows. The weight of their mission was clear in every silent step, every cautious glance. "Are you sure about this?" Hastings whispered, his breath visible in the cold night air. Poirot's eyes, sharp as ever, remained focused. "I have been watching, Hastings. The muddy prints by the lake. They appear and disappear, never older than 24 hours. Tonight we will find out who leaves them." Their descent through the servants' stairs was soundless, like two phantoms in pursuit of the truth. Stepping out into the damp moonlit grounds, the rain shimmered like liquid silver beneath their feet. They moved through the archway, and towards the lake, where a lone figure stood beneath the drooping branches of a weeping willow. Clara Mumford, her face pale in the moonlight, stood motionless, her black shawl soaked from the rain. She didn't flinch as they approached, as if she had been expecting them. "I knew someone would come," she murmured, her voice distant, lost in the rain. Poirot stepped closer, his voice calm but insistent. "It is late, madame." Clara turned her face toward him, her eyes weary, older than the day before. "I used to come here with Lillian," she whispered. "We'd throw stones into the lake and pretend they were our wishes. This place, it was hers." A silence lingered, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her, his mind racing. "You are hiding something, madame." Clara avoided his gaze, her eyes darting to the lake. "You wouldn't understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot stepped closer, pressing gently. "Try me." The silence stretched before Clara finally spoke again, her words weighed down by regret. "I lied about the night she died," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I did come downstairs after I heard the door slam." Poirot said nothing, his eyes narrowing in concentration as Clara continued, her voice cracking. She was standing by the window crying. The man had already gone. Poirot leaned in, his voice steady. "Did you see who it was?" Clara hesitated, her lips trembling. "No." But she kept whispering his name, over and over like a prayer. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "What name?" Clara's lips parted, a name so soft it barely escaped her lips. "Martin." The name hung in the air like an unspoken curse. Poirot's expression remained impassive, but his mind was racing. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low. "I went back to bed," she confessed, her shame palpable. "I was afraid. I didn't want to be caught. I didn't want to know what it meant." She paused, then added, "But I saw something else." Poirot's eyebrows arched, intrigued. "What did you see?" Clara swallowed hard. She was holding something, a small parcel wrapped in tissue. "I think it was the brooch, the family heirloom. I think she was going to return it." Poirot's mind churned. "Return it to whom?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know." The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with the weight of secrets. Poirot spoke again, his voice gentle but probing. "Did she ever speak to you about her intentions? About what she was planning to reveal?" Clara nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "She said she had written a letter. She was going to read it at the harvest ball. She said it would change everything. People would never look at Lady Eugenia the same again." Poirot's mind raced as Clara's words hung in the air. "But no one has found it," she whispered, almost to herself. Poirot turned away, lost in thought. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. Back in the warmth of the parlor, Poirot took a deep breath, wiping the dampness from his coat. Hastings, always the pragmatist, poured 2 glasses of brandy. "She lied to us," Hastings remarked, handing one to Poirot. "But now she's admitted it. That's progress, isn't it?" Poirot didn't respond immediately, his gaze distant. "She is afraid," he finally said. "And when one is afraid, the truth tends to slip through." He sipped his drink, then continued. "She heard Lillian say Martin's name. That confirms the identity. And she saw the brooch. That confirms the motive." Hastings nodded slowly, piecing things together. "So someone in the house knew about Lillian's plan and stopped her." Poirot didn't answer immediately. He walked over to a bookshelf, pulling down a dusty leather-bound volume. "Lillian was going to reveal something," Poirot murmured. "Something that would bring shame to Lady Eugenia. Something old. Something buried." He flipped through the book until he came upon the family history, pausing at an entry from 1892. He turned the book toward Hastings. "Look here," he said. Hastings peered at the page, reading the entry aloud. "Lady Eugenia, unmarried, had a sister named Beatrice Arlingham. Beatrice's name is followed by a simple note. Deceased, no issue." Hastings frowned. "But someone scratched out those words," Poirot said, his voice lowering, and penciled in a haunting line. "Issue. Unacknowledged. Removed to the village." The room grew cold, and Poirot closed the book with a snap. "Hastings," he said softly, "old secrets never vanish. They only slip into silence, waiting to be uncovered." The morning dawned like an old forgotten secret, a pale light seeping through thick clouds that clung to the horizon. The air felt heavy, as though it too was burdened by the weight of things unsaid, and the cold wind whispered of a past that refused to stay buried. In Greystone Hall, the family moved through the house like shadows, their movements stiff, their words few. Lady Eugenia presided over breakfast with a thin, icy smile, while Edwin buried himself deeper into the newspaper, as though it might shield him from the secrets looming in the room. Clara excused herself early, her movements frantic, her mind clearly elsewhere, while Colonel Montfort sipped his coffee with the tension of a man who knew better than to provoke the stillness. But Hercule Poirot was the only one who seemed unbothered by the ghostly silence, his mind racing with questions and theories that no one else dared voice. He wasn't interested in the meal. His thoughts were consumed by the letter that never arrived. Hastings, walking beside him in the quiet of the library, questioned Poirot's certainty. "Do you believe the letter still exists?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the knowledge of things yet to be uncovered. "I do, Hastings," he said, trailing his fingers along the dusty spines of the books, as though they held the secrets to a puzzle long unsolved. Miss Arlingham was not impulsive. She had purpose. A woman like that would never leave her final declaration to chance. His voice lowered as he spoke, as though the very act of revealing this truth might make it real. Hastings followed Poirot's movements, watching as he approached the writing desk, his attention focused on the subtle clues others might have missed. Poirot opened the drawer, his fingers sifting through the items within, until he found what he sought. A blotting paper, marked with the faint imprint of words long ago written. Poirot held it to the light, reading the ghostly reverse imprint. "Cannot live in silence anymore. The bloodline is not as pure as you have claimed." The words, though faint, were unmistakable. This was no mere scribble. It was a message, a confession, a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Poirot turned to Hastings, his face grim. "This is a draft, Hastings. A copy." His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, as though the very walls might offer up the answers. "Lillian Arlingham wrote the final version elsewhere. And that is where I must go." The detective's voice held a quiet certainty, the kind that left no room for doubt. Later that afternoon, Poirot sought Lady Eugenia in the sunroom, a place suffused with the fragrance of lavender oil, and the fading scent of chrysanthemums. She didn't rise when he entered, but her eyes flickered with the coldness of someone who had long since learned to mask their emotions. "You are here about Lillian's letter," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. Poirot gave a respectful nod, but the question hung between them like a cloud ready to burst. "Then you admit you knew of it," he replied, his voice soft yet unyielding. Eugenia's eyes flashed briefly, but her composure remained intact. "I knew she was unstable," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She imagined wrongs where there were none." Poirot stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. "Yet you don't believe her death was an accident, nor was it by her own hand. So if not her own, whose?" There was a long pause, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Finally Lady Eugenia spoke, her voice quieter now, tinged with a reluctant truth. "Lillian was the child of a delicate union," she said, her eyes distant. "My late husband's niece. Yes, but her mother, my sister-in-law, was a woman of poor judgment. She disgraced herself with a man from the village." Poirot's eyes narrowed, sensing the depth of what was being hinted at. "The child of scandal," he murmured. Eugenia's gaze grew colder. "Yes, and she bore a child in secret, a child who was never truly an Arlingham, though we raised her as one of our own. But she always knew somehow." Poirot said nothing, his thoughts turning over the words like a puzzle with missing pieces. Eugenia leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying him. "And now you understand," she said, the words heavy with implication. "That is why I wish the case reopened. If she was murdered, it was because someone was afraid of what she might have revealed." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick with the promise of more to come. And Poirot knew the next chapter of this twisted tale had only just begun. The morning air at Greystone Hall was thick with tension, a cruel chill sweeping through the manor, as Hercule Poirot sat at the breakfast table, his eyes sharp and calculating, like a predator studying his prey. Across from him, Captain Hastings couldn't hide his intrigue, but also his impatience, sensing that something monumental was on the horizon. "You're saving your appetite for a spectacle, I see," Hastings remarked dryly, buttering his toast. Poirot didn't even glance up, his eyes focused on the sealed letter resting before him like a dormant viper, its contents a mystery that gnawed at the very fabric of the family's past. "One cannot solve a murder on a full stomach, mon ami," Poirot responded coolly, his voice betraying nothing but an impenetrable calm. He carefully unsealed the envelope, the crack of the wax echoing in the stillness. Inside, the words written by Lillian Arlingham, the words that were meant to expose everything, were waiting to be revealed, but Poirot knew that the truth would not come all at once. "Today," he said softly, "we find the brooch." Hastings blinked in disbelief. "You think it's still here?" Poirot nodded with quiet certainty. "Indeed, and I believe it is hidden in the last place anyone would think to look." The search began in the most unassuming of places, the maid's quarters, a cramped, forgotten room on the upper floor, tucked away from prying eyes. The butler, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, hesitated, but granted them access. Inside, the room was bare, save for a narrow bed, and an old wooden trunk at its foot. Poirot's sharp eyes darted around the room, seeking the invisible threads of deceit. "Why here?" Hastings asked, his brow furrowed. "Because," Poirot replied, "Lillian Arlingham was not a fool. She feared for her life, and knew that if there was a traitor among them, it would be someone overlooked, someone invisible. She would never hide such a thing in her own room." His cane tapped against the floorboards, a rhythmic sound that resonated with the weight of their investigation. Suddenly, a hollow sound rang out beneath one plank, and Poirot moved swiftly, his gloves removed, his hands steady as he pried the board loose. The room seemed to hold its breath, as he withdrew a velvet-wrapped bundle. With delicate reverence, he revealed the brooch, a Victorian piece, encrusted with amethysts and tiny pearls, its pin slightly bent as though it had borne witness to a secret history. "It was hidden all along," Hastings murmured, astonished. Poirot's eyes darkened. "This brooch was not merely sentimental," he explained, holding it up as though it were a key to a locked door. "It was Lillian's truth, worn with the mourning dress, a declaration of her freedom from the past. It tells a story, the story of a woman no longer ashamed, no longer bearing the weight of her family's secrets." The brooch had been Lillian's final act of defiance. With the brooch in hand, Poirot summoned the household to the drawing-room, where the air was thick with unease. Lady Eugenia, regal and poised, stood near the fireplace, her face a mask of unreadable calm. Edwin shifted uncomfortably behind her, his face pale and drawn, while Clara Montford fidgeted with her gloves, clearly agitated. Colonel Montford, ever the skeptic, appeared to resent the summons, his arms crossed, as if he already knew what was coming. Ivy Lee, the last to arrive, looked weary, but her curiosity was palpable. Poirot stood before them, the brooch in one hand, and the sealed envelope in the other, the weight of his next words heavy in the room. "Madame," he began, his voice deliberate, "the time has come to unveil the truth behind the death of Miss Lillian Arlingham." He paused, letting the words linger in the air, and then with a slow, deliberate motion, he placed the envelope on the table. It was time. The truth that Lillian had so carefully hidden, the letter that had never been read, the brooch that had been the silent witness to her final declaration, now they would all be exposed. The room held its breath as Poirot prepared to reveal the mystery that had haunted Greystone Hall for far too long. The storm had passed, but the heavy, suffocating silence in Greystone Hall seemed to cling to every corner of the grand estate, thick with the secrets it had concealed for so long. Hercule Poirot stood motionless, his dark eyes piercing each individual in the room, with a steady, unyielding gaze that could read their very souls. He had cracked the mystery wide open, and now the truth was hanging by a thin thread, one that was about to be severed. He turned slowly, lifting the brooch delicately, as though holding it in reverence. It was more than just a family heirloom, more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything Lillian Arlingham had fought for, and everything that had been stolen from her. This, Poirot began, his voice a soft but commanding whisper, was not merely a trinket. It was the last thread of hope for a woman who had been cast aside, forgotten. Lillian Arlingham wore this as a reminder of her true heritage, a heritage that would have shattered the illusions of this family. He glanced at Lady Eugenia, her face now taut with an unspoken fear. Despite the mask of dignity she wore, her eyes betrayed her, narrowed, cold and full of something much darker than mere disdain. Poirot's voice softened, but there was an edge to it, a quiet but undeniable force. You feared this truth, did you not, madame? You knew what it meant for your family, for your carefully constructed world. But it wasn't just the lie of bloodlines that you feared. It was the unraveling of the power you wielded so carefully, so deceptively. Lady Eugenia stood still, her hands trembling ever so slightly, but she did not speak. The air grew heavier, as Poirot turned to Edwin, whose face had lost all color, his once proud countenance now a mask of dread. Poirot's piercing gaze fixed on him, and his voice was almost a sneer as he spoke. You, monsieur, Poirot said, his words slow and deliberate. You confronted her the night before she died. You saw her as a threat to everything you held dear. Your reputation, your legacy, your family's name, the shame that she would bring to light, was something you could not allow. So, you did what you thought you had to do. You tried to silence her. Edwin's mouth opened to protest, but no words came. Poirot's eyes flicked back to Lady Eugenia, and his voice turned colder. But it wasn't only you, was it, madame? He continued. No, your silence gave permission. It was your silence that condemned her to die, that allowed the truth to be buried beneath layers of lies and control. The room was as silent as the grave. The truth hung there, thick and suffocating. And then from the back of the room, a voice cut through the tension, a voice that made everyone freeze in their tracks. Ivy Lee, a young woman whose innocence had once seemed unquestionable, stood tall. Her voice rang out, soft but sure. It wasn't Edwin, she said, her words steady, her gaze unflinching. All eyes turned to her, shocked by her sudden declaration. She spoke again, this time with a quiet intensity. It wasn't Lady Eugenia, either. She paused, her gaze locking with the Colonel's. It was Colonel Montfort. The room gasped in unison, as the Colonel's face drained of color. He stood, frozen, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. His lips trembled, but he said nothing, the mask of composure slipping away, as though it had never existed. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Colonel Montfort, he said, his tone a quiet, deadly whisper. You followed her that night, did you not? After the argument, you trailed her down to the lake. You feared the truth she was about to expose, the secret she would reveal. And so you did what you thought necessary. You made sure she would never speak again. The Colonel's mouth moved, but no words came. He opened and closed his lips like a fish gasping for air. But the truth had already been spoken. Poirot stepped closer, his figure imposing as he leveled a stare at the man. It wasn't an accident, was it? She didn't simply fall as you claimed. No, the bruises on her arms, the angle of her fall, the way her body had been positioned. These things tell a different story. You shoved her, didn't you, Colonel? You made sure she would never be able to walk away and expose your shame. The Colonel's face twisted with rage and fear. But still, he said nothing. Poirot turned, his eyes never leaving the man. You made it look like a stumble, a tragic accident. And the family, eager to avoid scandal, looked the other way. They wanted the lie to remain intact, and so they chose to believe you. But you, Colonel Montfort, have been revealed. Poirot's hand extended, and he placed the brooch into Ivy's hands with a quiet, almost reverent gesture. For Lillian, he said softly, so she will not be forgotten. The weight of the room's collective silence was shattered as the police arrived. their presence an unspoken finality. The colonel was led away without resistance, his expression hardening into something cold and distant, the facade of a proud officer of the crown replaced by the grim reality of a man who had been exposed for the monster he truly was. Poirot stood at the window, his gaze following the colonel's departure. The rain outside fell in steady sheets, but inside, the tension remained, thicker than ever. Captain Hastings stood beside him, his gaze thoughtful. "Poirot," he began slowly. "Why the silence? Why did he not defend himself?" Poirot's fingers adjusted his cufflinks with a precision that belied the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He stared at the colonel's retreating figure, the answer coming to him in a soft, almost regretful murmur. "Because he knew, Hastings," Poirot replied quietly, his voice filled with a heaviness that only he could understand. "He knew that his crime was far worse than murder. The act itself was a tragedy. Yes, but the true crime was what he stole from her. He didn't just kill Lillian, he killed her hope, her chance to reclaim her truth, to free herself from the lies that bound her. And that is something far more unforgivable than death itself." He turned away from the window, his eyes dark with the weight of it all. In silencing her, he killed the one thing that could have redeemed them all, the hope of truth. Poirot let out a long, weary sigh, the kind that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken words, secrets long buried. The evening had been heavy, filled with the weight of things left unsaid, of ghosts lurking just beneath the surface. She had remained eerily silent, her mind clearly filled with the sort of thoughts that threatened to crack the fragile peace around them. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't hiding behind her usual grace and composure. The room itself felt colder, as if the very walls could sense the tension that had begun to settle in. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a mere flicker, casting long eerie shadows across the room as Poirot, seemingly lost in thought, prepared to take his leave. But just as his hand was about to touch the door handle, a voice, soft yet commanding, made him stop. It was Lady Eugenia. She stood by the window, her figure a silhouette against the pale glow of the evening sky. Her eyes were fixed on the garden outside, but there was no mistaking the sorrow etched into her face, or the quiet sense of inevitability in her posture. The rain had begun to fall in a soft drizzle, and the willow tree by the lake seemed to droop, almost in mourning, as if echoing the sadness that hung in the air. "I should have told you sooner," she said, her voice betraying the turmoil within. "About the letter. About everything." The words hung in the air, thick and unspoken, as Poirot remained silent, waiting. He had learned long ago to listen with patience, knowing that the truth often came not in bursts but in fragments. She took a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders telling him that this was not easy for her. "I knew that Lillian's truth would eventually surface. I raised her as my own, but I never loved her like my own flesh and blood. Perhaps that is my sin. I tried to preserve the Arlingham name, but in doing so, I suffocated hers." There it was, the admission of guilt that had been lurking for so long. Poirot remained seated, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the quiet way he folded his hands that spoke of understanding. "And yet you called for me," he said softly, the words not accusing, but rather seeking a deeper understanding. She paused, her eyes briefly flicking toward him, but it was clear she was far from finished. "I called for you because when she died, I knew it wasn't by her own hand. And part of me needed to know who could be so capable of such cruelty. Even if that person was someone I had welcomed into my family." Her voice wavered slightly, the ice around her beginning to crack. Her eyes were distant again, focused on something beyond the window, beyond the garden, her mind seemingly drifting back to a time when her world had been simpler, before the lies and the betrayals had taken root. "Do you believe in forgiveness, Mr. Poirot?" she asked, almost as if daring him to answer. Poirot rose from his seat slowly, his gaze unwavering as he met her eyes. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm, as though each word were carefully chosen. I believe in truth, madame. And sometimes, truth is the only path to forgiveness. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, it seemed as though the entire room had held its breath. Then, without another word, she turned away, looking once more out into the rain-soaked garden, as if the answers she sought might somehow be waiting out there. As Poirot made his way toward the door, he found Ivy waiting for him in the hallway. She was clutching Lillian's journal to her chest, her eyes bloodshot, though there was a new quiet strength in her demeanor. "She left something for you," Ivy whispered, her voice barely audible over the heavy silence of the house. Poirot took the note from Ivy's trembling hands, his fingers brushing lightly against the delicate paper. It was a simple thing, folded neatly, as though it had been placed with great care. He opened it, his eyes scanning the words. "To Mr. Poirot, should anything happen to me, trust Ivy. She knows my heart, and will know what to do with the truth." There was no signature, just a small pressed forget-me-not tucked inside, its petals delicate, almost fragile. Poirot closed the note slowly, as though the act itself held a sacred weight. The room around him seemed to hold its breath, as if it too understood the gravity of the moment. Later that night, as the house settled into an uneasy slumber, Poirot found himself drawn once more to the lake. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, cast a soft silvery glow across the water, turning the lake's surface into a mirror of shifting shadows. Poirot stood there for a long while, the weight of the night pressing down on him, the wind rustling through the trees like whispers from the past. He reached into his coat and pulled out the brooch, now polished and gleaming softly in the moonlight. Kneeling by the weeping willow, the very spot where Lillian had last stood alive, he placed the brooch gently on the soil, as though offering it as a tribute, a silent promise of justice, even if it had come too late. "For you, Lillian," he whispered, his voice a quiet prayer, his words hanging in the damp night air like a fragile thread between the past and the present. Moments later, Captain Hastings joined him, his footsteps soft on the wet earth. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the rustling of the wind in the branches above them. "Do you think she knew it would end this way?" Hastings asked quietly, his voice tinged with something akin to regret. Poirot shook his head, his eyes never leaving the place where the brooch lay. "No," he replied softly. "She hoped it would not. But she prepared. That, Hastings, is what courage is. Not in facing death, but in planting truth where it might one day grow." They stood there, beneath the heavy branches of the willow, as the wind stirred the leaves and scattered petals into the water below. The moment was quiet, solemn, but in it, there was a sense of finality, as if the echoes of the past were finally being laid to rest. Poirot's voice broke the silence, soft and reflective. "Some murders are not committed with rage," he said, his words slow, deliberate, but with silence, with shame, and with the refusal to let another live freely. But tonight, Lillian is no longer silent. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the night deeper, as if the weight of those words carried with them the promise of something that could no longer be undone. The finality of it all hung in the air, an unspoken truth that had finally come to light. The next morning, as Poirot and Hastings prepared to leave for London, an unexpected visitor arrived at Greystone Hall. The knock at the door was hesitant, almost unsure, as though the man standing on the threshold didn't know if he had any right to be there at all. The butler answered it, and Poirot could see the unease in his face as he returned. "There's a man at the door, sir," he said, his voice strained. "He says his name is Martin Ellison." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his curiosity piqued. "Show him into the drawing room," he instructed, his voice calm but edged with intent. The door opened, and Martin Ellison stepped into the room, his figure a little awkward in the grand space of the hall. He was younger than Poirot had expected, probably in his late 20s, though there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, a quiet grief in his eyes. His hair was damp from the mist that had settled over the countryside, and there was a palpable unease about him. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice rough with the weight of something unspoken. "The shops were closed, and I heard from the village about what happened, about Lillian." Poirot's eyes studied him carefully, offering no interruption, sensing that this was yet another piece of the puzzle that was beginning to take shape. "I know I wasn't supposed to be part of her world," Martin continued, his voice faltering as the truth of his involvement settled upon him. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. Martin's presence in the house, his words hinted at something deeper, something connected to the story they had been chasing. Another thread to unravel. And Poirot knew, with a quiet certainty, that the answers to the final questions were hidden within this young man's words. Martin stood at the edge of the garden, the weight of his confession sinking deeper with each passing moment. He hadn't meant to vanish, but the threats had come swiftly, cutting through his resolve. It started with a warning, a whisper in the dark, a voice that carried promises of violence. "Leave the village or something terrible will happen," they had said. At first he had dismissed it, thinking it was nothing more than a desperate plea. But the broken glass, the shattered remnants of his shop, had painted a different picture. Destruction was no longer a vague threat. It had become a reality. The once sturdy walls of his life had crumbled, just like the sanctuary he had tried to build with Lillian. "You're in danger," she had warned, her voice trembling, but resolute. Lillian, the woman who had made him believe in a future beyond the secrets, beyond the bloodlines that ruled their lives. He thought of her often, her pale face, the fire in her eyes as she declared they would escape it all, one day. She had spoken of freedom, of being unchained, of love that wasn't weighed down by history or titles. But the letter she left him still burned in his memory, the words etched deep, a painful reminder of everything they would never have. "I will wear the mourning dress at the ball," she had written, "and then I'll speak the truth about my past, the truth that's been buried for far too long. It won't change who I am, but it will change how they see me." She had been determined to reveal it, no matter the cost. He begged her not to go through with it, but she insisted, her resolve unshaken. "The truth is mine to tell," she had said. A bitter laugh escaped Martin's lips as he spoke. The walls were closing in around her, he muttered, as if speaking to himself. Poirot's eyes were steady, watching him intently. "Did you see who threatened you?" Poirot asked quietly, but Martin shook his head. "No, I never saw his face. He wore a hat low, but his words, 'She doesn't belong to you,' those words will haunt me forever." Hastings, leaning against the doorframe, crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "And what of Lillian?" Poirot asked, his voice softening. Martin's eyes filled with sorrow. "She didn't deserve this. She was finally finding herself, and they tried to take that from her. They wanted her silence." He reached into his coat pocket, fingers trembling, and pulled out a tarnished silver locket. He held it out, and Poirot accepted it, noting the delicate chain that had clearly been worn many times. Inside was a portrait of Lillian, her likeness captured with such tenderness. Yet there was something haunting in her eyes. On the back was an inscription, the words so small they could barely be read. "To the one who saw me." Poirot's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Finally, he placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. "She saw you, monsieur. You were the truth she needed, the one thing that remained untouched by the lies that clouded everything else." Later that day, as the autumn sun dipped behind the hills, Ivy Lee met Poirot in the rose garden. Her face was pale, her movement slow as if weighed down by 1,000 unspoken words. "He came back?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Yes," Poirot replied, his voice steady, "and Lillian's heart will rest easier for it." Ivy's gaze faltered, the weight of her own decisions visible in her eyes. "Do you think the family will accept him now?" she asked. Poirot looked towards the looming stone facade of Greystone Hall, his face unreadable. "No," he said quietly. But it no longer matters. Ivy nodded slowly, a silent acceptance in her gesture. I've been offered a position elsewhere, she said, her voice distant. A school near Bath. I think I'll take it. There's nothing left for me here. Poirot regarded her with a soft smile. His eyes filled with a quiet understanding. You were her confidant. You stood by her when no one else would. That kind of loyalty is rare. Ivy's gaze dropped to the ground. I just hope I did enough, she murmured. Poirot lifted her chin gently with his finger, his touch reassuring. You did what no one else could. You listened when no one else cared. As the car rolled away from Greystone Hall, the road slick with melting frost, Hastings turned to Poirot. His brow furrowed. Do you think they'll ever change? He asked, his eyes lingering on the estate, growing smaller in the distance. Poirot remained silent for a long moment before replying, his voice low but firm. No, he said. But perhaps the truth will outlive their pride. He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon, then added softly, and perhaps that is justice enough. The last days of October passed. The quiet of the Kentish countryside, broken only by the whispers of the wind. At Greystone Hall, the trees shed their golden leaves like tears, as if mourning not just the season but the life that had been stolen. In London weeks later, Hercule Poirot sat in his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, polishing the silver head of his cane, as he hummed an operatic aria, his mind calm amidst the chaotic sounds of the city. It was then that Captain Hastings arrived, precise as ever, a furrowed brow marking his face. Have you seen this? He asked, tossing the Kent Courier onto the table. Poirot glanced at the headline, his lips curling slightly. The Arlingham family has announced the closing of the Hall for a period of reflection. Lady Eugenia has retired to her sister's estate in Scotland. Clara has filed for separation from her husband. Poirot's eyes darkened as he read on. The storm, it seemed, was far from over. Colonel Montfort Hastings sat back in his chair, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air like the faint smoke of a distant fire. His fingers absent-mindedly drummed against the table as he processed the magnitude of what had been revealed. Justice, Hercule Poirot remarked, was often a quiet visitor, not heralded by fanfare, but delivered in its own time. He reached for the small weathered envelope that had sat untouched by his side, the soft clink of silver from his cane accompanying his movement. Speaking of justice, Poirot said, his voice calm but carrying an underlying edge of resolve. I received a letter this morning. Hastings raised an eyebrow, a signal that his attention was fully piqued. Without hesitation, Poirot passed the letter over, the paper faintly yellowed with age, but still carrying an undeniable weight. As Hastings read the carefully penned words, Poirot observed him closely. The letter was from Ivy Lee, a woman whose name had become intertwined with the tragedy of the Arlingham family. She spoke of her newfound role at St. Mary's in Bath, of children who craved kindness, and of a quiet, unspoken resilience. Martin is reopening his shop, Ivy wrote, somewhere far from the Arlinghams where no one knows their name. He wears the locket she gave him every day. As for me, I wear the memory of Lillian, not as a burden, but as a shield, guarding me from the shadows of the past. Hastings handed the letter back to Poirot, his usual composure shaken. Do you think they will be all right? He asked, his voice lacking its usual firmness. Poirot, ever precise, folded the letter with deliberate care before speaking. They will grieve, and they will rebuild, he said softly, his gaze unwavering. Unlike the Arlinghams who built on lies, Ivy and Martin have built on truth. Even the smallest house, when constructed on truth, can weather any storm. The words hung in the air, profound in their simplicity. Later that day, Poirot made his way to Greystone Hall one last time. The estate, once brimming with wealth and secrets, now felt empty, abandoned by its own history. The trees were stripped of their golden leaves, as if mourning not just the season, but the fall of the Arlinghams themselves. In the back garden, beneath the once grand willow tree, A simple stone marker had been placed. Lillian Arlingham, it read. Dressed in mourning, but lived in defiance. 1899 to 1934. Poirot stood there, his figure framed against the grey sky, and from inside his coat, he produced a single forget-me-not, its delicate blue petals contrasting against the cold stone. He placed it gently at the base of the stone, the act both solemn and defiant. "No more silence, mademoiselle," he whispered. "You were seen." As he turned to leave, the weight of the moment was not lost on him. It was not just the end of a case, but the end of an era. Hastings, waiting near the car, broke the silence. "Well, that's the end of the morning dress affair, isn't it?" Poirot offered a small, knowing smile. "Non Hastings," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It is the end of a lie, and the beginning of remembrance." As the car pulled away from Greystone Hall, the air once heavy with secrets, now felt lighter, as if the estate itself was finally free from its oppressive past. The truth, revealed at last, had breathed new life into the stillness. But Poirot knew, deep in his bones, that not all was yet resolved. And so 3 days later, as the fog rolled in thick over the Kent countryside, Poirot turned to Hastings with an unexpected announcement. "We are returning to Greystone," he said, his voice almost cryptic. "There is still something unfinished, something that lingers in the shadows." Hastings, taken aback, could only manage a stunned, "But I thought it was all over." Poirot's response was calm, his mind already set on the path ahead. "A murder has been solved, yes," he admitted. "But a mystery remains. Something left behind. Something buried." It was only 3 hours later that they stood once more before the imposing facade of Greystone Hall, its grandeur now diminished by time and neglect. The tension that had once clung to the house was gone, but Poirot's sharp instincts told him that something still stirred within its walls. Mrs. Fellows, the housekeeper, greeted them warily, dust rag in hand, her suspicions clear. "Back again, Mr. Poirot?" she asked, her voice edged with uncertainty. "I wish to examine one room," Poirot replied simply, his gaze unwavering. "The old nursery." Hastings frowned, confused. "The nursery? But why?" Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice a low murmur. "Because no one has asked what happened before Lillian, before the dress, before the letter. But in that nursery, history may still speak." Mrs. Fellows hesitated, but eventually led them through the dim corridors, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust. The door to the nursery was faded, its lock broken, and as Poirot entered, the room seemed frozen in time. A child's dollhouse sat in the corner, its intricate details softened by the years. A rocking horse, its paint chipped and worn, stood beside a window with a cracked shutter. The air was thick with the musty scent of abandonment, but Poirot moved with deliberate care, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. He approached a tall cupboard in the corner, its door warped but still holding fast. He opened it slowly, revealing only a cracked tea set, and a small lace-trimmed blanket embroidered with the initials B.A. The discovery was simple, almost too mundane for such a grand mystery. But Poirot's eyes gleamed with understanding. "Beatrice," he whispered under his breath, the name like a key turning in the lock of his thoughts. The pieces, once scattered, were beginning to fall into place. The story was not over yet. The dim glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across the room, but Pugh's mind remained illuminated by a thought too persistent to be ignored. The journal, Lillian's true mother's journal, was a revelation, a haunting window into a past buried by deception and silence. Pugh sat in a comfortable armchair, holding the fragile pages in his hands as Hastings poured over the fire, unable to shake off the feeling that they had not yet uncovered the whole truth. "This journal," Pugh muttered, his voice thick with the weight of the discovery, "is not merely a story, it's a confession, a map to the heart of what went so terribly wrong." He recounted the fragile poetic script inside the book, recounting the shame of a mother torn apart by the weight of her choices. She had been forced to live in shadows, giving up her daughter to another's name, bound by the expectations of a society that would never forgive her love, her defiance. As Pew continued, his gaze seemed to pierce through time itself. And yet, he said, turning the last page, she never stopped seeing her child. She watched her grow, helpless from a distance, haunted by the hope that somehow, one day, the truth would find its way out. Hastings remained silent, the air thick with the weight of the secrets they had uncovered. It was then that Pew's sharp mind began to turn. He knew this was far from over. It wasn't merely about the murder. No, this was about unraveling a deep-rooted legacy of lies. The next morning, after a night of careful contemplation, Pew stood at the gates of the old churchyard in Bath, the cool wind brushing against his coat. Ivy Lee, now a woman of quiet grace and hardened resolve, met him with a gaze that said she knew what had to be done. The journal, wrapped carefully, was placed in her hands. "Read it," Pew urged, his voice quiet but insistent. "Then decide. Decide if this is something to keep hidden or something to set free." Ivy's fingers trembled slightly as she grasped the journal, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered, a promise echoing in her words. "This is Lillian's truth, and it belongs to her legacy, not the shadows." Later, as Pew returned to London with Hastings, he finally allowed himself to speak the thoughts that had been gnawing at him. "Do you think Lady Eugenia knew about the journal? I wonder if it frightened her," Pew mused, as they walked through the foggy streets, the city alive with whispers of its own dark past. Hastings raised an eyebrow, not quite understanding. Pew paused, glancing over his shoulder as the fog seemed to envelop them both. "It was not just about hiding a child, Hastings. It was about hiding a truth so terrible, so haunting, that it would destroy the carefully constructed world they had built. And in the end, the earth does not forget." Hastings, pondering this, stood silently as they reached his flat. Pew continued, his voice a soft murmur now. "The Arlinghams may vanish from history. Titles will fade, portraits will gather dust, but Lillian will live on. Her memory will survive, not in the halls of Greystone, but in the hearts of those who truly knew her, and in the words of a mother who loved her enough to keep the truth alive." That night, as Pew stared out the window, the fog slowly dissipating, he felt a deep, quiet certainty settle within him. There would be no more lies, there would be no more hiding in the shadows. The truth, once buried deep, was now free to stand in the light. But little did they know, the darkest chapter of the Arlingham story had yet to be fully written. Only when they returned to Greystone Hall once more, did they realize that the final key to the mystery lay hidden behind a forgotten portrait. The attic was full of secrets, dusty and neglected, but one last truth had been waiting there, hidden for decades beneath a false panel. And when Pew finally uncovered it, a single silent breath escaped him. The portrait, a forgotten face, so eerily familiar, was not just a relic of the past. It was the final clue, the key that would unlock the last unanswered question. Was it truly Lillian who had been trapped in the web of deceit, or was there a deeper, darker figure at play? As the fog of Greystone Hall thickened once more, Pew knew the truth was far more complicated than anyone had ever imagined. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against the chest, suffocating, as Pew stood before the grand portrait of Beatrice. It was a life-sized masterpiece, stunning in its quiet power, though the years had done their work, darkening the varnish and blurring the finer details. Yet, despite the tarnish of time, her gaze was alive, unwavering and intense, as if she were about to step out of the frame at any moment. The artist had captured her with a delicate grace, her posture serene yet charged with an unspoken tension, as if she had been interrupted mid-song, her fingers suspended above an invisible piano. In the flicker of her eyes, there was a longing that felt both tragic and prophetic, a deep, untold story yearning to be heard. For a long moment, Pew simply observed her, his mind working through the layers of mystery that seemed to radiate from the painting. He could feel the presence of the woman in the room, an energy that spoke to him in ways words could not. This painting was hidden. Hastings' voice broke through the quiet. a touch of reverence in it. Deliberately, Pure responded, his tone equally subdued, yet thick with meaning. To see it was to remember the shame that haunted this family, a shame they could not escape, no matter how hard they tried. His eyes drifted to the bottom corner, where faint, almost invisible initials lingered. Ellison, he whispered, the name lingering in the air like smoke. Of course, the artist was Ellison. Hastings looked at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. Ellison, as in, Martin Ellison's father. Pure nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yes, his father was the artist. He was commissioned to paint Lady Eugenia, Beatrice's sister-in-law. But it was Beatrice who captured his heart, an affair that would be forever buried in secrecy, hidden in plain sight, in this very room. Hastings looked stunned, the revelation settling over him like a heavy cloak. But that means, his voice trailed off, as if trying to piece together the implications of what Pure was saying. Yes, Pure replied softly, his gaze unwavering. Not only was Martin Ellison's father her lover, but he was also her cousin. This is not just a portrait. It is a portrait of a woman caught in the web of forbidden love, of scandal, and of a family torn apart by secrets. As the evening wore on, they made their way to a quiet pub in the nearby village, where Martin Ellison had agreed to meet with Pure. When shown the photograph of the painting, Martin's face shifted in an unmistakable progression. First surprise, then recognition, and then something deeper, more painful. My father painted this, he said, his voice trembling, almost lost in the weight of memory. I was just a boy when it was done, but I remember her, Beatrice. I remember how he would disappear for hours, locked away in the attic with the painting. I never understood why. He never spoke her name, but I always felt something. He never looked at her without a kind of sorrow. Pure placed a hand gently on Martin's shoulder, his voice soft, almost consoling. She loved him, he said quietly, and their daughter grew up, never knowing the truth that was buried with Beatrice. Martin nodded slowly, his eyes distant as if the years were falling away, revealing the boy he once was. I didn't know, he whispered. Not then, and not until now. Pure removed the photograph from his hands, folding it carefully before placing it into Martin's palm. Perhaps it is time, Pure said, his voice laced with a quiet intensity, for someone to remember her, for who she truly was. When they returned to London, the ride back was unusually silent. Pure, typically so poised and composed, seemed lost in thought, his mind working through the unraveling story like a puzzle. Hastings watched him closely, sensing the depth of the case was affecting him more than he let on. You all right, old chap? He asked, his voice gentle, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. Pure nodded, though his eyes remained distant, gazing out over the rippling waters as they passed beneath the bridge. I was just thinking, he said quietly, as the sun dipped low, casting its golden light over the Thames. So often, murder is not the beginning. It's the end of something far older, a lie, buried long ago, a door closed in love, a child hidden, a name erased. This case, Hastings, it was never really about death. It was about identity, and what a person must sacrifice to claim it, to protect it. A life lived in shadows, obscured by secrets. His voice grew softer, a rare note of weariness in it, as if the weight of it all had momentarily worn him down. And sometimes, the truth, it takes generations to bloom. We are not always meant to know it immediately. Sometimes, it takes years, or even a lifetime, for the truth to rise to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. Hastings said nothing, simply nodding, understanding that this case, more than any other, had touched something deep within Pure. They arrived at Whitehaven Mansions as the evening settled around them, the city lights flickering on in the distance, casting their reflections onto the glassy surface of the water. Pure, still lost in thought, glanced up at the sky, where the last traces of daylight were being swallowed by the night. There is a price to silence, he said, his voice thoughtful, almost melancholy, and sometimes, it's paid in ways we can't even begin to imagine. Poirot folded his hands, the storm outside shaking the very walls of the estate. As he turned his gaze toward Mrs. Fellows, the night had taken a darker turn, and with it the secrets that had been buried for far too long began to surface. The child she bore in secret. Poirot's voice cut through the silence. The one they tried to erase is the key. Mrs. Fellows' face paled, the memories flooding her mind with an intensity that seemed to choke her. She whispered, her voice trembling, "I was there in the East Wing. It was a night like no other, a storm that seemed to rage not just outside but within the house. Beatrice gave birth early, and it was I who held her first. I remember her dark eyes, so familiar, as if they were a reflection of something long lost. They weren't unlike yours, if I may say so, Poirot." He did not react, but the smallest hint of recognition flashed across his face. The words hung in the air, suspended in the storm's howl. "Afterward," Mrs. Fellows continued, her voice faltering, "Beatrice was taken away to a convalescent home. The story they spun was that she'd suffered a nervous collapse, but when she returned she was not the same. Broken. They made sure she was never allowed near the child again." Poirot's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze never leaving her as the room seemed to close in around them. "And the child?" he asked, his voice soft but demanding. "The child was passed off as a Eugenia's niece," Mrs. Fellows answered, her voice heavy with regret. "Lillian, they called her, but the truth was a shadow, and the lie we lived with was even darker." She paused, guilt seeping through her words as she looked down. "I watched Lillian grow up. Sweet, curious. She would often ask about old photographs, portraits locked away in the attic. But we always told her the same story. Beatrice had died, and she was simply Lady Eugenia's responsibility." Poirot's voice was measured, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. "Do you believe your silence served justice?" Mrs. Fellows bowed her head, unable to meet his gaze. "No, I do not," she whispered, the weight of years bearing down on her. "I betrayed that child every day I kept quiet." Poirot placed a gentle hand over hers, his tone steady but firm. "Then let us not betray her now." The air in the room seemed to shift as the words settled between them, and the gravity of their implications lingered like an unspoken promise. Later, as Poirot and Hastings walked along the overgrown path that circled the garden near the old conservatory, the night seemed to hold its breath. "You've gathered pieces," Hastings remarked, his voice low as if afraid to disturb the delicate web of truth being spun. "But what remains?" Poirot's gaze fixed on the abandoned glass house, its cracked panels and twisted vines like the remnants of a forgotten world. "There is one final thread," he murmured, his voice distant yet filled with purpose. "The last person to see Lillian alive may not have been Colonel Montfort." Hastings blinked in surprise. "You mean someone followed her that night?" Poirot nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking into the still night air. "Yes, someone who knew about the letter, someone who needed it to disappear." Hastings' voice faltered, his mind racing. "Lady Eugenia." Poirot's gaze hardened, his voice grave. "Perhaps. Or someone even closer." As they entered the conservatory, the air inside was thick with dust and neglect, the glass panels cracked and the vines curling through the beams like the fingers of something long forgotten. The bench where lovers had once sat was damp, cracked by time, but Poirot's attention was fixed on the moss that clung to the ground. He bent down and picked something out of the overgrowth, an ornate silver-tipped hairpin, unmistakably Lillian's. "She was here," he said softly, almost to himself. "The night she died, she came here first. Not just to the lake. This was where she sought refuge." He held the hairpin up to the faint moonlight, his eyes dark with the implications. "The morning dress she wore wasn't a message. It was her armor. Whatever she carried with her that night. I fear it did not stay in her possession long." His gaze shifted toward the east side of the house, a cold resolve settling in his voice. "And now, Hastings, we must speak to the one person who had more access to Lillian's private things than anyone else, the maid." The air grew heavier as they approached the servants' quarters, Amelia Wright, the youngest member of the household staff at Greystone Hall, was a quiet, invisible presence in the house. Barely 20, she had come from a neighboring village, her demeanor fitting seamlessly into the household's rigid expectations. She was always there in the background, her movements swift and discreet, carrying trays, tidying rooms, fetching shawls. If anyone had touched Lillian's personal belongings, Poirot suspected it was her. As they found Amelia polishing silver in the dimly lit servants' quarters, the smell of metal polish thick in the air, Poirot noted her nervous start upon seeing them. She nearly dropped the tray she was holding. "Miss Wright," Poirot said kindly, his voice laced with authority. "I must trouble you for a moment." Amelia set the tray down, smoothing her apron as she stepped back, her hands trembling. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice small. "You were present the night Miss Lillian died," Poirot continued, watching her closely. "Tell me what you remember." Amelia swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the floor as her hands twisted the hem of her apron. "I helped her dress for dinner, brought her tea afterward, and then I went to my room, sir." Poirot's gaze hardened slightly. "Did you see her leave her room that night?" Amelia hesitated, her breathing shallow. "No, sir," she whispered. Poirot studied her with unblinking intensity. There was something in her eyes, something more than just fear. He could almost see the truth there, buried under layers of fear and obligation. "Miss Wright," Poirot said slowly, "the truth has a way of coming to light, even when we try to bury it. And you, my dear, are closer to it than you think." The silence in the room thickened, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Poirot's gaze never wavered as he stood before the young maid, Amelia Wright, whose pale face betrayed a mix of guilt and apprehension. His voice, soft yet commanding, broke the silence. "Miss Wright, the time has come for you to reveal what you know. Your silence has shielded more than just your conscience. Now it may be the key to justice for Miss Lillian." Amelia's hands trembled as she clutched her apron, eyes darting nervously around the dimly lit room as if seeking refuge in the shadows. After a long pause, she spoke in a barely audible whisper. "I saw her leave, Miss Lillian. It was late, just before midnight, and she was carrying something, a small wrapped parcel." Poirot's brow furrowed as he leaned in, urging her to continue. "Where did she go?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. Amelia's breath hitched. "She went toward the conservatory, through the side door, and I saw Mr. Edwin follow her, just after she passed." Poirot's heart raced as he absorbed the weight of her words. "Did he see you?" Amelia shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, he didn't notice me." Poirot's hand tightened around his walking stick, his mind already racing through the possibilities. "Thank you, Miss Wright," he said, his voice now colder, more resolute. As they departed, Hastings, ever the skeptic, muttered, "Edwin. But why follow her? What would he gain?" Poirot's voice was low and thoughtful. "He would gain control over the letter, Lillian's final damning letter. It must have been destroyed, or hidden, and now we must find it." Later that evening, Poirot summoned Edwin Arlingham to the drawing room, where the tension was palpable. Edwin entered, his demeanor rigid, eyes betraying none of the fear that Poirot knew was churning beneath the surface. "Mr. Arlingham," Poirot began, his tone calm yet unwavering, "I must ask you about the night your cousin Lillian died. Where were you after dinner?" Edwin stiffened, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "In my study reading," he answered, his voice devoid of emotion. "You didn't leave the house?" Poirot pressed, studying Edwin's every movement. "No," came the curt reply. "And yet you were seen," Poirot continued, his words sharp, cutting through the lie like a knife. Edwin's face drained of color. "By whom?" he asked. But Poirot's response was dismissive. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you followed Miss Lillian. You saw her leave with a parcel, and you caught up to her. What happened then?" Edwin's hands fidgeted, his expression faltering. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his voice low and deliberate. "You have a choice, Mr. Arlingham. Speak now, and perhaps there is still a chance for forgiveness." But remain silent, and you will be judged for what you did, or failed to do. Edwin trembled, his voice cracking as he confessed. I never meant, I didn't push her. She slipped, I tried to grab her. But it was too late, I was scared. And I thought no one would believe me. Poirot studied him for a long moment, the silence between them thick with unspoken truths. The truth, Mr. Arlingham, will not absolve you, but a lie will condemn you, Poirot said softly, rising to leave. Hastings, ever the doubter, leaned in. Do you think he's telling the truth? Poirot's mustache twitched as he replied. Not entirely. He may not have pushed her, but he was there when she fell, and he left her to die. Hastings frowned. What now? Now, Poirot said with grim resolve. We find the letter. Edwin may be guilty, but the truth will speak for Lillian. The next morning, Poirot was up before dawn, his movements swift and purposeful. Hastings struggled to keep pace, his usual morning routine disrupted by Poirot's newfound urgency. Where are we going? Hastings asked, trying to catch his breath. The letter, Poirot replied, his voice sharp and focused. It must still be somewhere. Lillian's words cannot simply vanish. As they made their way to Edwin's study, Poirot's mind whirred with possibilities. The study was a room of order and quiet. Every book on the shelf meticulously arranged, every paper neatly aligned. But it was the desk, mahogany, polished and pristine, that caught Poirot's attention. It smelled of old leather and cigar smoke. A room that exuded control. But what secrets did it conceal? Poirot's eyes scanned the room, searching for the smallest clue, the faintest hint that would lead him to the letter. As his hand brushed against the papers, he could almost hear Lillian's final cry for help. The letter, her last hope, buried somewhere within these walls. The search had begun. Poirot stood motionless in the dimly lit study, his eyes scanning the room with practiced precision. His fingers brushed over the edge of the mahogany desk, lingering on the faint dust that hinted at recent disturbances. But it was the absence of certain items that intrigued him most. No journals, no personal notes, no signs of the man's private thoughts. Nothing but a facade, he murmured under his breath, turning toward Hastings, who was observing the room with a puzzled expression. Do you see it, my friend? Hastings furrowed his brow, glancing around. What's missing? Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, as he gestured toward the bookshelves that lined the walls, all impeccably arranged. A man who spends hours reading, yet where are his personal reflections? No diaries, no scribbled thoughts, nothing to betray his inner workings. This is too tidy, too deliberate. Hastings' eyes widened with realization. You mean, he's hiding something? Exactly, Poirot replied, the air of certainty thickening around him. And it's not in plain sight. Come, let's see what else we can find. Their search led them to Edwin's bedroom, a sterile, almost clinical room devoid of any personal warmth. The bed was perfectly made, the clothes neatly pressed, but again, nothing to suggest a connection between the man and the woman who had been so tragically lost. Poirot's keen gaze darted around, then fixed on a small locked box tucked away in the wardrobe. With the butler's permission, he carefully pried it open, revealing only a few papers, a gold pocket watch, and an old photograph of Lillian as a child, beaming with innocence, while Edwin stood stiffly beside her, his face an unreadable mask. No letter, Poirot muttered, disappointment shadowing his otherwise composed face. Closing the box, he turned to Hastings, his voice low, but filled with determination. Think, Hastings. Where would Edwin hide something he didn't want anyone to find? Hastings paused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Not in the house, surely. If he knew the investigation would be thorough, he wouldn't leave it lying around. Precisely, Poirot said with a nod. But I have a hunch. We're looking in the wrong places. As the pieces fell into place, Hastings' eyes sparked with recognition. The shed, he said softly. The gardener's shed. They made their way to the unlocked shed at the back of the property, its contents seemingly unremarkable. Spades, shears, and old seed sacks littered the floor. But Poirot's sharp eyes found something different beneath the mess. A small rusted tin box. It was barely noticeable, tucked away under the pile. With deliberate care, he opened it, revealing an envelope sealed. But not with wax. Just the simple impression of a closure that could only mean one thing. The handwriting was unmistakably Lillian's. Poirot's fingers gently unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the contents with a calm that betrayed the storm raging in his mind. He read the final words slowly, allowing the weight of the truth to settle upon him. When he finished, he exhaled softly, and carefully placed the letter back in its envelope, slipping it into his coat pocket. Hastings leaned in, his voice tight with impatience. "Well, what does it say?" Poirot's eyes were distant, almost unreadable. "It says exactly what Lillian wanted to reveal, and exactly what got her killed." That evening, as the household gathered once more in the drawing room of Greystone Hall, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The once grand room now seemed almost suffocating in its silence, its furniture draped in dust, its air thick with the lingering presence of untold secrets. Lady Eugenia, Clara Montfort, and Edwin Arlingham sat like statues, each nervous, each on edge. Ivy Lee lingered near the door, her arms crossed tightly, her gaze shifting between the faces in the room. Poirot stood at the center, his usual composed demeanor replaced by an intensity that radiated from him, as he held up the small, unassuming envelope. "In my possession," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the stillness, "is the letter that Miss Lillian Arlingham intended for you all to read, a letter she was never allowed to deliver. The words within it not only explain her final actions, but also point directly to the cause of her death." Edwin's hands twitched on the armrest, his fingers drumming nervously as he shifted in his chair. Lady Eugenia's face tightened into a grim line, and Clara, though pale, seemed to be bracing herself for the inevitable. "The truth is," Poirot continued, his eyes never leaving the group, "this letter holds the key to everything. If Lillian had spoken those words, her fate, and perhaps all of yours, would have been very different." The room held its breath, the quiet broken only by the soft hiss of the gas lamp, as Poirot prepared to reveal the final devastating truths. The cold, lingering silence in the room felt unbearable as Poirot unfolded the letter, with a reverence reserved for the most precious of objects, his every motion deliberate, each fold of paper steeped in quiet tension. His voice, calm and unwavering, filled the heavy air. "To my family," he began, his words almost seeming to echo in the stillness of the room. "I have spent my life walking in the shadow of others, bound by their expectations and their rules. They have dictated how I should dress, how I should speak, how I should grieve. But tonight, I cast off these chains. For tonight I wear the dress you despise, not to provoke, but to free myself." The words, dripping with quiet defiance, hit like a sudden storm. Lady Clara's breath caught, and Ivy, standing by the doorway, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her posture tense. Poirot paused, allowing the weight of those words to sink in, before continuing, his tone growing darker. "I have come to understand the truth about my mother, the woman you painted as mad, the woman you silenced in your twisted version of love. She was not insane, she loved me, and she suffered for me, and I will no longer pretend that I do not see her in the reflection of my own eyes. Every time I look into a mirror." There was a sharp intake of breath, and Poirot's eyes locked onto Lady Eugenia, whose face had paled under the weight of those revelations. "Tonight, I wear the brooch she left behind," Poirot continued, his voice steady but fierce. "I claim her as my mother, and myself as her daughter. I no longer care for the Arlingham name, nor for the lies you wrapped it in. I care only for the truth, and after tonight, the silence will end. Beatrice's child will no longer be hidden in the shadows." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable, as Poirot folded the letter once again, the room thick with anticipation. The crackle of the gas lamp was the only sound that dared break the silence. Finally, Lady Clara spoke, her voice trembling as she whispered. She knew. Poirot's gaze remained unwavering. Yes, he confirmed softly, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. She knew, and she intended to tell all of you that night, at the harvest ball before everyone. She was going to wear the mourning dress you so despised, the brooch you denied her, and declare her freedom. It was meant to be her declaration, her final act of defiance. Poirot turned his attention to Edwin, who sat rigid, his face a mask of horror. "And you," Poirot said, his tone sharp. "You feared that declaration. You followed her to the conservatory, confronted her, tried to take the letter from her hands." Edwin's voice trembled as he stammered. I was just trying to stop her. She was going to make a fool of herself." Poirot's eyes flashed coldly. "No, monsieur, you did not intend to kill her, but in your desperation you fought. You pulled at the letter. She ran, and you followed her, to the lake." Edwin's face crumpled as he tried to speak, but Poirot's words drowned out his stammering. "You saw her fall, saw her struggle in the water, and yet, you turned away. You left her there to drown." There was no denying the truth in Poirot's words, and Edwin buried his face in his hands, his entire body shaking with guilt. Eugenia, ever the picture of composure, remained unmoving, her lips pressed into a thin line. Poirot's gaze shifted toward her, his voice colder than before. "You may not have struck the blow, madame," Poirot said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife, "but your silence, your complicity in this family's lies, created the conditions for this tragedy. You erased Beatrice, erased the truth of her child, and in doing so, erased the very heart of this family. And now at last, that lie has shattered." Lady Eugenia opened her mouth, but no sound came. Poirot placed the letter on the table, his eyes scanning the room, each individual drawn into the gravity of the moment. "This is Lillian's truth," he said softly, "the truth you tried to bury, and now it will be buried no more." The silence that followed was profound, as if the house itself had exhaled the breath it had been holding for years. The family's fragile foundation, built on deceit and silence, had cracked irreparably. The next morning, Greystone Hall was a shadow of its former self. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere seemed to suffocate the mansion's once grand halls. Lady Eugenia remained locked in her chambers, her whereabouts unknown, and the shattering sound of breaking china had echoed through the estate, a grim reminder of her unraveling state. Rumors swept through the staff that she planned to leave for her sister's estate in Scotland, never to return to Greystone. Clara, pale and trembling, sat in the grand morning room, her hands unmoving around a cup of untouched tea, her eyes hollow as if the life had drained from her entirely. She could no longer look at Edwin, the man who had betrayed her in the most devastating way, and instead wandered aimlessly through the overgrown gardens, as if trying to reclaim some part of herself lost in the chaos. Edwin, now a pariah in his own home, refused to leave the library, spending his days pacing, trapped in a prison of his own making, consumed by the consequences of his actions. The weight of the truth was too much for this fractured family to bear, and in the silence that followed, Greystone Hall seemed less a home, and more a tomb. As the days bled into weeks, Greystone Hall stood as a silent witness to its own unraveling, its once immense grandeur, now reduced to a hollow shell, the echoes of its former glory tainted by the fractured family within. The staff had long since departed, leaving behind the faint smell of polished wood and dust, a sad reminder of a time when laughter and conversation filled its walls. Inside, Edwin's days blurred into one indistinct haze, the weight of his guilt pressing down upon him like an invisible hand. Though he had narrowly escaped arrest, thanks to Poirot's careful maneuvering, he could not escape the suffocating truth of his actions, the truth that clung to him relentlessly like a shadow he could never outrun. Whispers of disinheritance stirred through the remnants of the household, carried on the wind like a cruel omen, and it seemed that the Arlingham legacy was all but spent. The finality of it all settled over him, a sense of impending doom that no amount of money or privilege could erase. Meanwhile, Poirot and Hastings, ready to leave the crumbling manor behind, shared a quiet conversation, their words laced with a gravity that reflected the moment. "Do you think they'll ever recover?" Hastings asked, his voice laced with uncertainty, his gaze lingering on the now bleak silhouette of the estate. Poirot, standing with a quiet dignity, adjusted his coat before offering a steady, almost resigned response. "No, they will not, but perhaps that is what they deserve." When Hastings pressed further, asking what would become of the broken family, Poirot's eyes narrowed, the weight of his judgment clear. "Eugenia will fade into the shadows, clinging to whatever dignity she has left. But it won't be enough. Edwin will live with his guilt, endlessly tormented by what he could have done, but didn't. And Clara, well, she may find a way to rebuild, but she is the only one who feels truly shattered. At least for her, that is a beginning." Hastings, ever the pragmatist, frowned at the idea, his mind struggling to understand the extent of the punishment. "But isn't guilt the worst punishment?" he asked. Poirot's smile was faint, tinged with something approaching sadness. "Guilt can be escaped, Hastings. But when a family splinters, when the lies that bound them dissolve, what they are left with is nothing but the jagged remains of what once was. That, my friend, is a punishment no jail cell could ever match." As they stepped into the waiting carriage, Poirot cast a final glance at the house. The morning light gleamed off the high gables like the edge of a blade, cold and unforgiving. Greystone Hall stood tall, but in the depths of its heart, it had already begun to crumble, eaten away by the lies it had fostered for so long. Hastings, ever the skeptic, broke the silence, asking, "Was it worth it then?" Exposing the truth, whose gaze softened as he looked back at the house, the truth settling in his chest like a weight he had long since learned to carry. "The truth," he said softly, "is never convenient, but it is always necessary." As the car rumbled away from the estate, the dust of Greystone Hall faded in the distance, leaving behind a shattered legacy and the possibility of something new. In the months that followed, Ivy Lee chose a different path, one that took her far from the echoes of Greystone. Accepting a position at a small boarding school in Bath, she found solace in the simplicity of teaching, the laughter of children filling the void left by the stifling secrets of the Arlingham family. Her new life was unremarkable to the outside world, but to her, it was freedom, an escape from the tangled web of lies that had once threatened to swallow her whole. One afternoon, while tending to a garden of roses at the school, Puz came to visit. Watching her gentle care for the blooms, he felt a rare sense of peace. "You've found your place," he remarked softly, watching the rhythm of her hands as they pruned the plants with a tenderness he had never expected from her. Ivy looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I think so. There's something calming about nurturing new life, rather than carrying the weight of old secrets." The two shared a brief silence before Puzke inquired about the journal, the one that had revealed the tragic history of Lillian's mother. "What did you decide?" he asked. Ivy set down the gardening shears, her hands dusted with earth, and met his gaze. "I read it," she said quietly. "Every word. I cried for what Beatrice endured, but in the end I decided to keep it private, not because I want to hide the truth, but because I believe it's done enough damage. Lillian's gone. Beatrice is gone. There's no one left to hurt, and no one left to heal." Puzken nodded thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "A wise decision, mademoiselle. You have given them peace, a gift that is not easily given." Ivy paused, looking at him with something like curiosity. "And you, Mr. Puz, do you feel at peace now that it's all over?" Puz's expression softened, but there was a trace of something unreadable in his gaze. "Peace," he repeated, his tone gentle but distant. "Perhaps peace is too grand a word, but satisfaction, yes. The truth has been uncovered, justice has been done, and now those who remain may find their own way forward." As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the garden, Puzken bid Ivy farewell. He left her standing alone in the garden, surrounded by the roses she had nurtured with such care. Her small act of legacy in contrast to the weight of the family she had left behind. And for the first time in months, the shadow of Greystone Hall seemed to lift, leaving behind the possibility of something new, something untouched by the lies of the past. Edwin Arlingham wandered the decaying halls of Greystone Hall, the mansion now little more than a tomb of his family's grandeur, its former splendor fading with each passing day. His mother, Lady Eugenia, had retreated to Scotland, leaving him the last surviving member of a once proud lineage, and the staff had long since departed, their presence now nothing but distant echoes. Alone, Edwin retreated into the library, pacing its grand shelves, grasping at books as though the knowledge within them might somehow absolve him of the weight he carried. Guilt for his role in Lillian's death, his own indifference that had allowed the tragedy to unfold. Days blurred together as he avoided the rooms that once held happy memories with her. The drawing room where laughter had echoed, the lake where they had once walked hand in hand, until one day a letter arrived. It was a simple envelope, no return address, just the neat familiar handwriting of Ivy Lee. The words within were direct, cutting through the haze of his indecision like a blade. There is no undoing the past, but there is a way to face it. Lillian's truth has been spoken, and now it is time for you to decide what you will do with it. Not for her, but for yourself. The words hung in the air, and Edwin found himself staring at them for hours. They were simple, yet they carried the power of 1,000 accusations. For the first time he saw the two paths clearly laid out before him. He could continue to live within the ruins of his family's shattered legacy, or he could walk away, rebuilding his life from the wreckage. It was the hardest decision of his life, but it was one he could no longer avoid. The next morning, Edwin packed his belongings with care, locking the library doors behind him, and for what he knew would be the final time, he descended the grand staircase. As he passed the drawing room, he paused, his fingers brushing the doorframe as the faint scent of lavender seemed to linger in the air, like the ghost of the past. He let his hand fall and walked on, leaving the hall that had once been the heart of his family's life. Edwin didn't leave to vanish into obscurity. He left to rebuild. In Canterbury, he found a modest flat, and took a position at a local museum, cataloguing artifacts and handling archives. The life he built there was simple, but it was honest. He worked in silence, his name no longer tied to the infamous Arlingham legacy, and his reputation grew not for his past, but for his dedication and quiet diligence. Edwin kept Ivy's letter in a drawer, taking it out occasionally, when the weight of Greystone Hall's shadow grew too heavy. It reminded him that the past could never be erased, but it didn't have to define him. Slowly, he found a peace in his solitude, a peace that came not from running away from his history, but from choosing to move forward, one quiet step at a time. The shadow of Greystone Hall remained behind him, but it no longer held sway over his life. He had made his decision, not to forget, but to live differently, and in doing so he found a redemption he had never thought possible. Yet even as he moved on, the tragedy of his family's fall remained imprinted on him, an ever-present reminder of the cost of buried truths. The portrait of Beatrice, painted in the summer of 1898, the year before her tragic downfall, captured her youthful elegance, her love, her strength, all frozen in time. Hercule Poirot studied the image for what felt like an eternity, tracing the brushstrokes with his gaze, before carefully returning the photograph to its envelope. The case had been solved, the tangled threads unraveled, yet there was something deeper, something more unsettling that lingered in his mind, an unresolved chord that refused to fade. It wasn't the resolution that haunted him, but the quiet bravery of the women at the heart of the story. Beatrice, who had loved against every obstacle, had fought for a future that was never meant to be hers. Lillian, who had defied the silence of a family built on secrets and deceit. Ivy, who had carried the weight of the truth, even when it threatened to consume her. The truth had been spoken, yet it felt like it was still unfolding, echoing in the silence that followed. As Poirot sat in his London apartment, reflecting on the case, Captain Hastings returned from his walk, carrying the morning paper, his face as unreadable as ever. He placed it on the table, and poured himself a glass of cherry, his eyes catching Poirot's distant stare. "Still thinking about Greystone?" Hastings asked, settling into his chair. Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It is a case that will stay with me, mon ami," he replied softly, his thoughts far away. Hastings raised an eyebrow, half expecting a longer explanation. "Because it was so complicated?" he asked. Poirot shook his head, his fingers interlacing as he leaned back thoughtfully. "No, Hastings," he said, his voice a soft murmur. "Because it was so human. Murder, my friend, is always a tragedy. But this was a tragedy born not of greed or rage, but from silence. A family that could not speak its truths. A legacy buried until it was too late." He fell silent for a moment, the weight of it all pressing in on him. "In the end, Hastings," Poirot continued, his tone contemplative, "I am reminded that justice is not only about finding the killer. It is about giving the voiceless a voice. Lillian was silenced in life, but her story, her truth has been spoken. And that, mon ami, is the greatest justice of all." Hastings listened in quiet understanding, raising his glass in a silent toast to Lillian, and then to the truth that had emerged at last. "To truth," he said, his voice hushed but resolute. Poirot's gaze softened, and he echoed, "To truth." His eyes, distant yet filled with a peace that had eluded him for so long, lingered on the empty space where once the shadows of Greystone Hall had loomed so large. And so the mourning dress affair, a case that had begun in mystery and deceit, found its final resting place not in the clamor of a courtroom or the dramatic flourishes of a grand reveal, but in the quiet recognition that every voice, no matter how faint or long silenced, deserved to be heard.